Greetings! If you're watching this film, then if you have not already watched my first video on the Crewkerne murder, then I suggest you watch it, because in this video we will identify the culprits, but it is important you have the full details of the crime first. I must caution you as we go forward, there are scenes which may prove to be distressing or are not for viewers of a sensitive discrepancy, involving details, recreations and images of a violent and brutal crime. Now let's go to the 1870s. Victorian England, as it were. November 16th, 1876. The streets of Yoville swelled with noise, laughter, and the clatter of hooves. This was the Yoville Winter Fair, an annual gathering of traders, farmers, and revellers. By day it was a marketplace for livestock and goods, but by night it was something else entirely. This was not a fair as we know it today. It was a place of business where cattle and livestock were bought and sold, where farmers struck deals over tankards of ale. But as darkness fell, the fairground transformed. Drunken fights broke out, tempers flared, and the air turned thick with tension. Yoville's winter fair was notorious for its trouble. The combination of drink, gambling and crowds drew in not only traders but criminals. Extra police were drafted in to keep order, patrolling the streets and watching for pickpockets, thieves and gangs who used the fair as their hunting ground. Among the crowds that evening were familiar faces, men with reputations. The Hutchings gang, a family of hardened criminals from Somerset, had come to the fair. They were well known to the authorities, and by nightfall they would be at the centre of one of the most brutal murders in local history. As the festivities continued in Yoville, two policemen set off on patrol from East Coker, PC Cox and PC Stacey. Their orders were clear: keep watch on the lanes leading from the fair, a known escape route for criminals looking to slip away unnoticed. The road they took was quiet, winding through open fields and past farmsteads. With only their truncheons for protection, the two officers followed the track towards Netherton, their boots crunching against the frost-covered ground as night crept in. At Netherton, they saw them, figures gathered around a cart, the Hutchings gang, Charles Baker, men known to police, men with histories of violence. Cox and Stacey exchanged glances. This was trouble, and in the next moments their routine patrol would turn into a chase. Obviously, Cox and Stacey chased after the Hutchings gang, suspecting that in their cart was stolen property. Along the path to Hardington and past Sutton Bingham, eventually the cart came to stop and the two police officers approached members of the gang. PC Cox and PC Stacey approached the cart, their lanterns casting flickering light on the men gathered around it. "What's your business here?" Cox called out. The gang hesitated. Then, without warning, fists flew. A bludgeon struck Stacey first. Cox barely had time to react before he was set upon. A heavy blow struck PC Stacey's skull. His vision blurred, the ground spun, and he collapsed into a roadside ditch. Darkness swallowed him. Minutes passed before he stirred, bloodied and dazed. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself up and stumbled towards Darwell Farm, desperate to raise the alarm. Lanterns cut through the night as men rushed toward Netherton. Near the roadside, Cox lay motionless, his uniform soaked in blood, his head brutally caved in. His truncheon was missing. The frozen ground beneath him was dark with violence. The scene left no doubt. This was a murder, savage and unrelenting. As daylight rose over Netherton, the gravity of the crime became clear. More officers arrived, inspecting the blood-stained road. A cart was brought, and PC Cox's body was carefully lifted and transported to the new inn at East Coker, where an inquest would soon begin into his brutal murder. The inquest at the new inn, East Coker, revealed the horrific injuries suffered by PC Cox. His skull was shattered, brain exposed, and his ear cut to pieces, likely from brutal kicks. Dr. Garland ruled the beating continued after death. PC Stacey, suffering severe concussion, was too weak to testify. As PC Stacey lay recovering in Yoville Hospital, he gave a statement to the police identifying Giles Hutchings and Charles Baker as two of the men involved in the brutal attack. His testimony set the hunt in motion. That same afternoon, Charles Baker was arrested at his home in West Coker. When questioned, he denied all involvement, claiming he had been at home on the night of the murder, but the police weren't convinced. With Baker in custody, the police turned their attention to the Hutchings gang. They raided the family's home at Hardington, where they found a cart, harnesses, and a large number of nets, evidence of recent poaching activity. But the Hutchings men were nowhere to be found. Much like with the murder of Ruth Butcher, 2 years prior, the scene of PC Cox murder became a Victorian spectacle, with thousands of Victorian grief tourists descending on the little lane in Netherton. For as long as the Hutchings were on the run, the newspapers reported daily. The night before his murder, PC Cox was restless. His wife later recalled that when he awoke on Thursday morning, he seemed disturbed. "I've had a bad night," he told her. "I dreamt I had a fight with the gypsies, and they gave me a terrible mark just here." As he spoke, he placed his hand on the very spot of his head where he would later be fatally wounded. When Dr. Garland arrived to break the tragic news to Mrs. Cox, she already knew. "Oh, I know he's killed," she cried, before he could even speak. Here is the original newspaper clipping from 1876, detailing the eerie and uncannily prophetic dream that PC Cox had the night before his murder. This adds a further layer of mythology to this famous yet forgotten murder case. With the killers on the run, a desperate manhunt swept across Somerset and Dorset. The countryside was scoured. Police combed the dense woods, barns and farmsteads, searching for any sign of the Hutchings gang. Rumours swirled. Some said they had fled to Bridport, others claimed they were hiding near South Perrott. In Yoville, crowds gathered at the station as officers arrived from Taunton, Ilminster and Crewkerne. The presence of so many police caused a stir. The town was gripped with fear and curiosity. In the woods of Pendommer, police forced their way through the undergrowth. The damp earth and fallen leaves showed no clear tracks. But the Hutchings knew the land too well. At one farmhouse, officers discovered a half-eaten meal of bread and cheese, as if someone had left in a hurry. By January 1877, nearly 2 months had passed since the brutal murder of PC Cox. The manhunt for the Hutchings had grown cold. Despite relentless police efforts, the fugitives had vanished into the countryside. But the authorities still had one man in custody, Charles Baker. Seated before the magistrates in Yoville, Charles Baker, labourer of West Coker, was formally charged with the wilful murder of PC Cox and the attempted murder of PC Stacey. He was questioned extensively by police, with Deputy Chief Constable Bisgood leading the interrogation. Baker remained defiant. He claimed he had nothing to do with the attack, insisting he was home at the time of the murder. However, when pressed on his whereabouts that night, his answers became vague, his alibi flimsy at best. One key witness was Mrs. Squibb, the wife of a local farmer in Netherton. She testified that on the night of November 16th at around 11 p.m, PC Cox and PC Stacey had stopped at her house for a short break. She served them a small jug of beer, Cox drinking a little more than Stacey. Both men were completely sober when they left. Not long after, she recalled hearing noises outside. The constables had resumed their patrol. The magistrates listened to the evidence carefully. Though Baker's role in the murder was not yet fully clear, they deemed there was enough to keep him in custody. He was officially remanded to stand trial. The long hunt for the Hutchings gang had stretched on for over 2 months. But on the morning of Saturday, the 22nd of January, 1877, the search took a decisive turn. At around 5 a.m, a local butcher named Vagg was driving from Chelborough to West Coker when he spotted a familiar pair, George Hutchings and his son Giles. The two men had been fugitives since November, wanted for the murder of PC Cox at Netherton. Rather than flee, they surrendered. Exhausted, starving, and out of options, they begged Vagg to hide them under a tarp in his cart and take them to the Yoville police station. At 7 a.m, Vagg's cart arrived at the station. Officers rushed out to find the elderly George Hutchings barely able to stand. One officer described him as half gone, barely clinging to life. His son Giles, though exhausted, appeared healthier but looked rough from weeks on the run. A closer examination of George revealed bloodstains on his trousers, raising questions about whether they belonged to PC Cox, PC Stacey, or someone else entirely. Even with George and Giles in custody, 2 more fugitives remained at large, Peter Hutchings and Charles Baker's close associates, George and James Richards. On Sunday afternoon, police searched the home of a local man in East Coker. As they entered, they discovered Peter Hutchings lying down, hidden beneath straw, desperately trying to avoid capture. His time was up. He was promptly apprehended and escorted to Yoville police station to face justice alongside his father and brother. That same day, the hunt continued, and police tracked down George and James Richards. They had harbouring the Hutchings after the murder and were wanted as accessories to the crime. The two men surrendered and were also taken into custody. That evening, crowds formed outside the county jail, eager to witness the fall of the notorious Hutchings gang and their accomplices. For the people of Yoville, the arrests brought relief but also anticipation. The men had been caught, but their trial was yet to come. George Hutchings, Giles Hutchings, Peter Hutchings, Charles Baker, and George and James Richards all faced serious charges. Manslaughter and murder for the Hutchings and Baker. Aiding and harbouring fugitives for the Richards brothers. At the Yoville Police Court, the prisoners appeared in the dock, weary, battered, and defeated. The magistrates formally remanded them for trial at the upcoming Somerset Assizes at Taunton. The courtroom was packed with curious onlookers. The public was desperate to catch a glimpse of the notorious poachers turned killers whose bloody deeds had shocked not just Yoville but all of Somerset. The press reported great satisfaction at the men's capture, but also hinted that public sympathy for George Hutchings, the old man barely clinging to life, was starting to build. The prisoners were transferred under heavy guard to the county jail, where they awaited their fates. The mood in Yoville was tense. People wanted justice for PC Cox, but many feared that the full truth of the attack might never be known. The 16th of March, 1877, 4 men stand trial at the Assizes Court at Taunton. George Hutchings, his sons Giles and Peter, and Charles Baker. The charge, the murder of Police Constable Cox. The hall is packed. Farmers, townsfolk, and officers lean in as proceedings begin. Presiding over the trial is the famed and fearsome Lord Chief Justice Cockburn. The prosecution recounts the facts. After Yoville Fair, Constables Cox and Stacey were set upon by a group of poachers at Netherton. Cox died where he fell, his skull smashed by brutal blows. Witnesses are called. Tracks, bloodstains, a shattered lantern, all described in grim detail. Then the surviving officer, PC Stacey, is brought forward. Pale but resolute, Stacey takes the stand. He identifies Giles Hutchings and Charles Baker as 2 of the attackers. He also names Peter Hutchings, seen close to the cart that night. The defence lawyers argue confusion, darkness, fear. Could Stacey have seen clearly? Could blows from the horse cart have caused Cox's injuries? Evidence shows George Hutchings was merely driving the cart, not striking blows. The jury is swayed. He is recommended for a free pardon. After hours of deliberation, the jury files back into court. The hall falls silent. The future of the Hutchings brothers and Charles Baker hangs by a thread. First, the foreman rises. George Hutchings not guilty of murder. He is granted a free pardon for his minor role as the cart driver. For Giles Hutchings, Peter Hutchings, and Charles Baker, the verdict is harsher. Guilty of manslaughter, but not murder. The prosecution could not prove who struck the fatal blow. The black cap, symbol of death, remains unused beneath the judge's seat. Instead, the 3 are sentenced to penal servitude for life, set at 24 years. There is a murmur through the courtroom. Some feel the punishment too light for a policeman's death. Others note the fine line between manslaughter and murder in the eyes of the Victorian law. Old and broken, George Hutchings never sees freedom. He dies in custody shortly after the verdict, this pardon coming too late to save him. There are many interesting stories that survive documenting the affairs of the Hutchings gang, who operated in South Somerset between 1865 and 1877. But in researching this case for the video, and also the one previously relating to the murder of Ruth Butcher at North Perrott in 1874, I came across something in the newspaper archives that startled me, something that connects both of these cases sensationally. I highly recommend at this stage, if you haven't watched my first video on the murder of Ruth Butcher, then you go back and do so before proceeding. So here's what I believe happened to Ruth Butcher that night. She met them whether planned or not, whether by invitation or coercion. Charles Baker, the man she had once been close to. Peter Hutchings, known for his volatility. And Giles Hutchings, whose cruelty, especially towards women, had already made him a danger to be near. Something triggered it. Maybe an argument, maybe a refusal. Maybe Ruth knew something she wasn't meant to repeat about their poaching, their schemes, or their secrets. And in the minds of violent, insecure men, that was enough. What followed wasn't just a killing, it was annihilation. Ruth's head and face were destroyed, her identity erased. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a silencing. a punishment. And it fits the pattern, the method, the escalation, because this was the same trio who just 3 years later would murder PC Cox in almost the same way. And then there's the bacon. When Ruth's body was found, a piece of bacon wrapped in paper was recovered from her pocket. At first it seemed inconsequential, but later a woman came forward. She said that same bacon had been sold that very night to the man who murdered Ruth Butcher. That man, she said, was Peter Hutchings. It was a casual transaction, except it wasn't, because that bacon ended up in Ruth's pocket. Either he gave it to her or she took it from him. Either way, it placed them together in the final hour. It's the thread that ties him directly to the scene, not just by motive or temperament, but by physical evidence, and it was ignored. Years later, a broken shepherd's crook iron, heavy, rusted, was found in a field near the murder site. It had been lying there for years, likely discarded after the crime. And I believe it was the murder weapon. The curvature, the weight, the trauma inflicted. It matches. It's what they used to beat her into unrecognizability. They didn't panic. They didn't flee. They adjusted, rearranged, took what they wanted, and disappeared into the fog of village life, back to their alehouses, back to their silence. And Ruth? She became the secret, the dry run, the rehearsal, the woman who knew too much and paid the price. And it wasn't until PC Cox's blood hit the same soil that anyone stopped them. Because it took the death of a uniformed man to do what the death of a woman never could. This is what I believe. Not speculation, but deduction, pattern, behaviour, testimony, time. This was not a mystery. It was a cover-up. And now we know who they were. If you want to understand why I believe these men murdered Ruth Butcher, you don't start with the night of her death. You start with their records, their reputations, and the trail of violence they left behind, long before and long after her murder. Let's begin with Charles Baker. By 1870, Baker had already been bound over for threatening to beat a man's brains out in Minturn Magna. That same year, he assaulted 2 different women in separate incidents, one settled out of court, the other punished with a meagre fine. By 1871, he was out in the fields again, this time poaching rabbits with a shotgun, running with other armed men. And by 1876, he was back in court for stealing partridges, denying everything, of course, while witnesses spoke plainly of what they saw. He was a man comfortable with violence, slippery with the truth, and, most importantly, already known to Ruth Butcher. Not just a neighbour, not just a drinker. But, as one witness described, someone she was intimate with. That's not gossip, that's motive. Then there's Peter Hutchings. Convicted in 1869 for a violent brawl, where he and his brother Giles attacked a man outside a Yoville inn. 2 years later, he's in another assault, this time threatening a man with a hatchet. In 1872, he and Giles assault a police sergeant, push him into a wall, beat him in the street, and laugh about it. 1 month in jail. That's all. And yet, that same Peter Hutchings was later identified in court by a shopkeeper. She said he bought bacon the night Ruth was murdered. That bacon, identical, wrapped in paper, was found in Ruth's pocket the next morning. That's not hearsay, that's placement. And then there's Giles Hutchings, the quiet one, but arguably the most dangerous of them all. In 1867, Giles was charged with threatening to kill his wife with a knife. He chased her out of the house, beat her, gave her a black eye, forced her to sleep on the floor. When she finally fled to her parents, he followed, broke in, assaulted her father, and threatened to slit her throat. This was a man who believed women were property. And when they stepped out of line, he punished them. When you look at these men in isolation, they're already dangerous. But together, they were lethal. A gang operating in and around West Coker, Hazelbury and North Perrott, poaching, threatening, drinking, intimidating witnesses, and by 1873, impersonating constables to extort money from local workers. And then in 1877, they struck again. They beat PC Cox to death in a field, Blunt force, trauma to the head and face. A public servant left disfigured. And this time, the law caught up with them. All three were convicted. The same three men, I believe, murdered Ruth Butcher. Same violence, same region, same overkill, same silence from the people who saw but said nothing. This wasn't random. This was a pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. I'm standing here in this quiet field in North Perrott, what was once called the Trendle Well. It was here, in the early hours of the 16th of March, 1874, that the body of Ruth Butcher was discovered, beaten beyond recognition, a murder so brutal, so personal, that it left this place marked in the memory of Somerset folk history forever. This isn't just a patch of grass, it's a crime scene. It's the beginning of a story the courts never finished, and for nearly 150 years no one was ever brought to justice for what happened here. Until now. Because when you lay the evidence bare, the violence, the geography, the witnesses, the testimony, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Ruth Butcher was murdered by the same men who killed PC Cox 3 years later. Charles Baker, Peter Hutchings, Giles Hutchings, known criminals, known poachers, known to Ruth. They were feared in this area. Locals knew their names, knew their tempers, knew to look the other way. And when Ruth crossed a line, whatever line that was, she paid the price for it right here in this field. And the men who did it escaped through that footpath just behind me. It leads down toward Hardington, the Hutchings village, or west toward Crewkerne. But the choice they made, I believe, took them home to Hardington, because that's where they came from. And that's where this trail has always pointed. It's true that John Genge, Ruth's former employer in Crewkerne, was initially suspected. He was seen arguing with her not long before her death. But arguments aren't uncommon, and the evidence simply doesn't hold. He didn't have the motive, he didn't have the history, and he didn't have the gang. Yenge, I now believe, was innocent. But the Hutchings brothers weren't, nor was Charles Baker. Their records are written in the courts, in the newspaper columns, in the bruises of their victims, and in the soil beneath our feet. What's remarkable is how modern tools, AI, digitized newspaper archives, lost police reports, fragmented witness statements, all came together to help piece this case back together. We took forgotten fragments and gave them voice again, and the picture that emerged wasn't vague, it was razor sharp. And yet, Ruth Butcher wasn't just a victim, her story lived on in music. A local folk song, The Ballad of Ruth Butcher, was written by Somerset singer Charlie Wills, carrying her name through generations. The lyrics speak of betrayal, of sorrow, of injustice. They were sung in pubs and parlours long after the headlines faded, because the people of this county didn't forget her, not really. And neither should we. This case may never see a courtroom, but justice doesn't only happen in trials. It happens when the truth is finally told, and when the names of the guilty are spoken aloud. Ruth Butcher's story was never cold. It was waiting for someone to finish it, and now, standing here where her life ended, I hope we finally have